Hi, everyone. It's Audrey.
And David.
We're so happy and grateful that you're here listening to us. We really want to thank the people who follow us on Apple Podcasts and have written reviews. We appreciate you guys.
We hope to increase our reach within the international education community, so we are asking for your help. Please follow our show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast listening app. We have posted instructions on how to do this on our podcast page.
If you like our show and the services we aim to provide, please rate us and write a review. This will help us grow our audience and support our mission of sharing the joys of international teaching with as broad a group as possible. We'd love to increase those numbers in Africa, South America, and Australia.
So thanks again for listening and for all your support. Let's recruit as many teaching peeps as possible to travel,
teach,
and connect with us.
If I look back on my 30-plus years in international education, there are some educators who really stand out to me as having a way with kids. Their ability to develop relationships of mutual trust and respect is second to none. Jeff Devens is one such educator. He has a way of putting everyone at ease. Jeff has been a guest on our show before, demystifying the complex world of taxes for American expats. In this episode, he joined us once again, this time to talk about his day job, working to support students and parents in international schools. Dr. Devens has worked in international education as a school psychologist, counselor, and classroom educator for 29 years. Growing up on public assistance and the only one of 5 children to graduate from high school, Jeff uniquely appreciates the hurt, heartache, and angst that parents encounter when raising kids. His first book, A Parent's Guide to Raising Kids Overseas, was released in 2018. Jeff is no stranger to raising kids overseas. Together with his wife, Nanette, who's also an international educator, he has raised 2 children, Silas, a college freshman, and Cora, a high school sophomore. During his free time, Jeff enjoys exercising, training jiu-jitsu, and helping expat educators with issues related to personal finance. But as I said, that's for another podcast. Our guiding question was, is parenting overseas different from parenting in one's home country? What are some things to think about? Here are a few topics Jeff addressed in this episode. What first-time overseas parents and students can experience with the start of school, how family systems can change when living internationally, the importance of community with the school at the center of it, cultural considerations and variations, stressed out students, particularly in the digital age, parenting styles, the importance of values, and fostering life skills. This show was recorded on August 30th, 2024. We suggest you have a notebook handy as Jeff guides us through the often complicated but never dull endeavor of parenting kids overseas. Relax. It's just Dr. Devens.
Hello, Jeff. Welcome back to the Educators Going Global podcast. Audrey and I, as parents and educators, we've really been looking forward to our talk with you. So welcome, and where in the world are you?
Hey, David and Audrey, good to see you. Good to hear from both of you. I'm currently in Singapore. I work at Singapore American School. This year is year 23 at the machine, as we like to call it, year 29 internationally.
Oh my gosh. Well, when we were chatting before, I was saying, man, I wish I was in Southeast Asia right now because it's 10 o'clock here in Boise, way past my bedtime. But we're happy to have you back on. Before you were with us talking about finances, but this show we're going to really get into your day job. You're working as a school counselor and helping parents do their best with their children. So that kind of leads into what we usually do as a going global story. Do you have one for us?
Yeah, so it was about 2006, 2007. At the time, I was working at SAS in the high school as a school psychologist. And oftentimes I get called in to help the counselors who have more significant, protracted crisis situations. And in this particular situation, I got called into the office to start working with a student, not a real name, by the way. Her name was Gloria. And so here she was, and I walk in there, and Dad's sitting there. Well, Dad, he's kind of slumped over to one side because of all the medals that he's wearing on the right side of his chest. And naval commander, you name it, he had it on his chest and apparel. And he and his daughter were in the thick of a huge argument. And she's swearing at him like a sailor, going up and down, just wouldn't have any of it. Finally, Dad, just in a bit of distress, says, see what I have to deal with? I tell my underlings what to do, and they just listen and obey, but why won't she? She goes storming out, right? And it's just a reminder that if we don't invest in our kids in terms of relationship, we can use authority while they're younger, but eventually what ends up happening is we've got to take out those withdrawals from that relationship account. And if there's nothing there, it's just going to lead to rebellion. This old adage of rules without relationships leads to rebellion. And unfortunately for this dad, this is what he was experiencing. So here's what I want to say from the onset. If you're a new family to international education, or if you're a family who's raising kids and you've been brought overseas because of your position of authority, president, vice president, COO, CFO, none of that matters. The only title that matters is mom and dad. And so ultimately it begs the question, what are you investing in that relationship? So it was a good reminder for me as I think about working with moms and dads.
Oh my gosh, what a tidbit. And that connects in my brain to friends of mine who've been administrators in dealing with high society people, princes, princesses in the Middle East, emirs, people like that. So that is phenomenal, that whole idea of helping parents realize that that persona of what they do outside of the family isn't going to carry over to the family. So
that's right.
Yeah, that definitely is something for folks to realize. All right, Jeff, let's dive into our guiding question, and it is parenting overseas different from parenting in one's home country? What are some things to think about? So that's a big, broad question. So let's break it down a little bit.
So leading into the first supporting question, when you consider going back to school and all that entails in a typical situation, now you've added another layer, because now you're the parent of what we call a TCK. And some things will still be the same about the back to school experience and some will be different. So maybe tell us a little bit about that, Jeff.
Yeah, the phrase TCK was coined by Ruth Van Ryken and David Pollock back in the 50s and 60s. They were working with missionary families at the time, and as a result of their time abroad, and then they would repatriate to the United States, they were different, not only the adults, but the kids. The cultural experiences that they had certainly impacted their development. They're living in a different country. They're being parented by a parent that has a different set of values. And oftentimes they're attending a school that has a ethos of the entire community's set of values. And so you have three simultaneous cultures mixing together, and hence the phrase third culture kids. And what they found as a result of that work was that this unique subset of the population had some interesting dynamics about them. Highly mobile, able to transition out of different cultures. They form relationships as a means of substance as opposed to, say, geography. They tend to be more adultish. That is, they grow up faster as a result of those international experiences. Now, I'll say in my 29 years working internationally with kids and families, the patterns that we see with kids are quite similar, but the influences on them, particularly since 2008, 2009 with the advent of the iPhone, we'll get into that a little bit, that's closed down some of those cross-cultural boundaries, has made those lines a little bit easier to see and recognize, so that the tether being in Singapore, for example, and being connected to grandma and grandpa through Skype, through Zoom, through chat, those sorts of things, those barriers are somewhat closing down. So that's kind of where that term came from. One of the interesting things, though, that I try to emphasize with parents that are new to this international experience is the cost of coming internationally. And what I mean by that is this: when you are signed up for an international posting, it's typically 3 years. with some sort of renewal. If you're in the military, it's typically 3 years before you rotate on to your next post. But that 3-year posting, they want to get all they can out of you in terms of employment. And the they is the organization that you've been hired for to work overseas. Historically, that had been the dad who was in the position of taking that job. So they work long hours, often frequent travel. They earn a good salary, but the trade-off is the lack of one or both parents' presence. And that comes with some costs, not just monetary. And we can get into that in a little bit, but typically these international schools are well funded, they're well staffed in terms of supports, and you have kids who are coming from two-parent families, and so there's a strong draw to want to perform well academically. So that's kind of a 30,000-foot view of international schools.
And as you look at the family dynamic changing with one parent potentially putting in so much more time and potentially also being on the road more, also, in my experiences, that second spouse sometimes gave up a job.
That's right.
Back in their home country. So that dynamic was going on. So then, where's their purpose? Where are they getting their meaning from? Previously, it might have been from their work. And then that kind of leads us into the whole idea of not only are the children dealing with the new cultural opportunities, but so are the parents. Those dynamics change as well.
Yeah. So really, the communities have a special flavor, and you alluded to that somewhat in your first answer, Jeff. But maybe you can delve a little deeper into how kids form cross-cultural communities. And as you mentioned, the ethos of the school, how that factors in, and the fact that really the school becomes your surrogate community and parent to some extent.
Yeah, very much. I was thinking back to about 1996, 97, when we first moved overseas and we began our work at the International School of Beijing. At that time, the school consisted of about 800 students, and the culture of China at that time certainly wasn't as open in terms of Westerners as it is today. And the school effectively was the hub of the community. You had kids from 30, 40 different nationalities there, but English was the common language that was spoken on campus. And a lot of the activities that happened around the school being the hub. And so we really wanted to encourage, and still do here at Singapore American School, for example, encourage parents to be actively involved. That's such an important piece of being a part of a school culture and a school community. I want to just back up a little bit and touch on something that David said a little while ago. Very often, the trailing spouse is very highly educated, successful, established in their career, established in their profession, and they make the choice as a family to make this run at this international experience. Oftentimes, they do it because they want an opportunity to see the world, experience different cultures, give something different to their children that will be more enriching, perhaps, than the current experiences that they're having. Regardless of the reason, you do have families who have to reacclimate or reorient. And so part of that work that David and Ruth undertook was helping us understand these stages of transition and the need for getting connected and being a part of a community. So when we enter a new space, there's this general sense of disorientation. And what happens is that spouse that's working, they know they're going to work. That child, they know they're going to a school. So in some respects, there's a semblance of normalcy, although there is going to be a bit of disorientation that happens somewhere within that first semester, that is 1 to 18 weeks or so, where they're having to acclimate to the new normal. But for that trailing spouse, it can be particularly difficult when the kids go off to school, the partner goes off to work, and they're left trying to figure out what to do or how to make that connection work going forward. So the school does become a connection for families to be involved with what's happening in the school. So not uncommon, not atypical to have parents on campus during the day, on the weekends, over breaks. It's just a wonderful experience to recognize that we're all kind of doing this together as a community.
So maybe now's an opportunity to talk about the loss and the change. It connects to the transitions, but getting into those stages that we often go through when we come to a new place, the honeymoon stage, the kind of down stage, and then the acceptance. Maybe if you could speak to that a little bit, that's pretty normal, even for veterans going from school to school.
Absolutely. So Part of our orientation, even with our faculty, is recognizing that there are common patterns of transition. And once we understand those patterns, it offers us a bit of bandwidth, a bit of grace for ourselves, for our children, for our partners to recognize the adjustments that they're making are actually by design. So typically when we enter a new environment, there's a honeymoon phase where it's exciting, it's engaging. People are super receptive. Corporations, schools, they kind of throw out the red carpet for families, typically happens around August or September. And people really do feel that sense of, wow, this is exciting and engaging. And then school starts, and then work starts. And the realities of the differences start to set in. And those differences actually lead to a bit of disorientation or disequilibrium, where you're kind of trying to figure out what is normal, what is different, and then can I tolerate the is different pieces and somehow combine those into my new sense of normal and routines. And so what we see with kids, for example, is there can be a slight disengagement from school. They're mourning the loss of peers. They're mourning the loss of relationships. They're mourning the loss of familiarity. And there's a process of time that needs to be provided for them to be able to navigate that process. Typically in a school setting, we say up to a semester or so about 18 weeks for kids to find a pattern. Our biggest concern with kids is not, are they going to do well academically? It's how do we help them find a friend? How do we help them get connected? How do we help them become part of a team? Whether that's a after school club, athletics club, arts, artistics club. Here at SAS, for example, we have roughly 50 different clubs that kids get involved with. The reason for these clubs, of course, is to build community and to be generative, giving back to others, that sort of thing. So that disorientation stage typically lasts anywhere from 3 to 18 weeks as kids and families make those transitions. But then what typically begins to happen is they settle into this new sense of normalcy. The biggest challenge is establishing consistency, predictability, and ultimately that's what leads to stability. And so as we work with kids and families, what we're really trying to emphasize to them is that importance of even your rules as a parent. And we'll get into this a little bit later on. They don't necessarily change because of geography. So what we're trying to do is help them understand that there are some key consistent pieces that you want to have as a family, but there are some unique pieces that their kids and they are going to be exposed to that we'll talk about in a little bit.
So we're talking about the culture of the school and the community and building those routines. So important. Stability. What about the culture outside the schools that you're coming in? A lot of the world now, to me, the differences aren't as big as they were 20, 30 years ago.
Yep.
You were talking about technology and being able to stay connected. But what about those cultural changes outside the school, the culture of the city, the culture of the school? How do you advise parents and new students in handling that?
Yeah, good question again. So a lot of times what happens is parents are coming overseas with a set of values, a set of beliefs, a set of practices. Those could be embedded in the culture that they came from. Those could include elements of faith, family, community, and many of those things they want to carry forward into the new culture that they're going to become a part of. The challenge is finding that community within that new culture and simultaneously being exposed to cultural variations that will shift, perhaps challenge, perhaps lead kids and parents to question what it is they believe and why they believe it when it comes to issues of faith and morality, political systems, cultural practices. All of these pieces are an inherent part of this international experience. Sometimes I'll have parents say to me, I don't want my kids exposed to certain things. And the things that they're describing are not inherently bad. It could be various religions. It could be different political systems, different cultural practices. And I often say to them, if you don't want them exposed to those things, you need to be able to do two things. One, you need to help them understand the why behind it, other than it's just forbidden fruit. And two, you may want to consider moving back home because your kids are going to be exposed to lots and lots of different perspectives and competing worldviews when it comes to what it is they believe and why they ultimately believe it. And so a lot of the work that we do with our parents, for example, in our parent boot camp sessions, when we onboard new families at the beginning of the year, is to get them thinking about what is their why? What is it that you're trying to be intentional about as a parent over the course of, in this case, the next 4 years of high school? Recognizing that you're attending a multicultural school, that you're attending a place that has teachers that have different passports of origin, which means they come from different cultural backgrounds. We might have an ethos that we try to abide by as a school community, but ultimately your kids are going to be influenced by their teachers, their peers, the existing culture, your values, and all of those things at different points along the way can create tension. But man, what a wonderful opportunity to sit at a table over dinner and talk about life. To be able to discuss issues of political systems or religious systems, economic systems, and know that it's not just theoretical. It's not just something on a TikTok video or YouTube, but rather this is part of what you're living at the moment. So those things, though, for some parents, it's quite threatening because their kids have reached a stage of life where they're actually starting to question the core values that mom and dad believe, which is an inherent part of adolescence, by the way. But the challenge with that is having parents who have answers that they give beyond because I said so and are willing to go along on the learning journey when they too begin to question what it is that they believe and why they believe it about these various pieces.
Well, key term there, learning journey, and helping people with their self-awareness, of course, when you're going overseas and you start hopefully taking on new perspectives, because you are going to see so many things that are going to be done differently. And I'll come back to what I was saying. I was generalizing, but much of the world is becoming homogenized in a lot of ways. That's my kind of take. So I'll never forget, I was in Britain at what we used to call an oil patch school. This was 30 years ago, and the families were from the deep south. The dads were the workers, and they had a lot of pressure on them. And it was an eye-opener for me just talking to these students. They thought Great Britain was like going to another planet. It was so different than deep south and their lifestyles and cultural awareness. So that was a groundbreaking moment for me as a counselor to kind of step in the shoes of this cultural group coming in. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like I'm reaching some inflection point in my career. So in full disclosure, I'm 50 years old. That grumbling was by design, by the way. And I know that I have less years ahead of me than I do behind in terms of my working profession. And what I've seen, particularly at the international school I'm at now, is a cultural shift in our families. And over the years, for example, we used to talk about the importance of autonomy, agency, independence, being able to be resilient, stand on your own, make your own choices. All those things we still want to help kids with. But the cultural variations that we're beginning to see with families of country passports, say, of India and China, without trying to stereotype, trying to be respectful and not overstep that boundary, but recognize the values and beliefs that we held as a school, that I hold as a father, that I try to help my students with, may not be the ones that the families that we serve want. So very often I will hear from families like this idea of agency and independence. It's all good insofar as our child is going to get a good education to help look after us. Because right now, grandma and grandpa are living with us, just like we are going to live with you somewhere down the road. And so there's a little bit of a clash of cultures here as we try to work this out. And what's at the center of that? The child. And so we're trying to help navigate those relationships as we think about what's in the best interest of that child, recognizing fully that we don't serve one child. We serve at SAS 4,000 children. And every family has a different dynamic or way of being. So it gets a little bit more challenging sometimes to hit that target of parenting.
So, Jeff, what about the role of technology in connecting people?
Yeah.
How does that come into play?
Yeah, that's a good question, David. We are in the midst of kind of, I don't want to say an existential crisis when it comes to technology, but it certainly is an inflection point, and there may be several more to come. Having access to technology, for example, during COVID was a godsend. To be able to connect with family, to be able to communicate, whether it was through text or at that time Zoom primarily. What a wonderful way to stay connected and to feel a part of a community when everyone was on lockdown. I think one of the big challenges we're seeing with adolescents is they're growing up with these tools as a means of community and, in their mind, a means of connection, but they're alone together. So you'll find these kids walking down the halls, staring at their devices, turning them sideways, taking pictures in their right hand primarily, and it's like an appendage on their body. And it's leading us to questioning what's happening with this device and how is it impacting our kids' ability to self-regulate, control their emotions, essentially what we tend to think of as being human. Now, in all fairness to teenagers, I'm again a fuddy-duddy. The phones came after my adolescence. And so the connection to that device or the seemingly need of it just wasn't there for me, and it isn't there. That all being said, what we're being faced with as a school, and it's not just an SAS issue, but this is true of many international schools and schools in the United States, is how do we integrate technology and realize it's a part of our learning, but that it actually can significantly impact our ability to learn. So what we often see, for example, with kids is they're spending 6-7 hours a day on their phones, Snapchat, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Netflix. And the challenge is trying to figure out how is this helping them become better humans? What is it about these devices that are actually creating a greater sense of community for us? And quite frankly, as I try to grapple with the answers to that question, I'm left wanting. I don't see it producing better humans. Actually, I see it producing more anxious kids. I see it producing kids who are sleep deprived. I see it with a lot of tension and conflict that's happening in the home. And part of this is understanding the nature of these devices. To get our heads around what's happening, we have to kind of take a trip back a little bit to Psychology 101 and recognize that there are a couple key facets of identity formation and schedules of reinforcement that are happening with these devices. So I'm just going to take a little bit of a segue here and jump into this and make it a little bit academic here. So when we think about children and the social emotional development stages they go through. Erik Erikson did some good work on this in the 1930s and 40s, talking about these stages of psychosocial development: trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus doubt and shame, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity formation versus role confusion. So we're going to park here for a second because this particular stage is really important for adolescent development. What are they plugging into in order to identify with their worth and value and purpose and esteem? And unfortunately, with social media, kids compare their worst attributes to the best of what they see on social media. And I want you to think about that for a second, listeners. They're comparing their worst attributes with the best of what they can find on social media: fabricated images, printed out, cast over, recalibrated, videos that are put together 50 times, like this one, by the way, with the edits, before we get to the final cut. The reality is what's happening with these kids is they're being fed a false narrative of what healthy, good, pure, kind, normal is. And as a result of that, there's no win with that kind of comparison. I call it living in the land of And when you live in the land of there's always someone prettier, nicer, kinder, smarter, happier. And again, this is a natural part, as Erikson pointed out, of what teenagers do in terms of identity formation. But now they have access to the World Wide Web, and the possibility of them going down these rabbit holes that are going to be maladaptive, harmful, hurtful for them increases exponentially. And parents, quite frankly, and I mean this as a parent, we don't really have a clue what's going on with our kids. We think that they don't have any friends and that they're alone and they just spend all their time in their room by themselves. They have a ton of friends online. They're being very social online. The other piece to this that's really important that I want to stress is the way these apps work. They are designed for screen time, but the way you get that screen time is old school Skinnerian conditioning. Variable schedules of reinforcement, continuous schedules of reinforcement. Let me give you a quick example. So some of you parents may not be familiar with, but have heard of Snapchat. Well, the basic premise behind Snapchat is you and a friend share a photo of something. Could be you, could be anything seemingly innocuous, 3 times in a row. And what you do then is you begin what's called your streak. And some of these kids have streaks that are thousands in number, meaning they have shared an image every day for over 1,000 days, but not just one streak. They might have 15 or 20 streaks going on or more. simultaneously. And you'll see them go on vacation. For example, we might have an interim semester where we take a week off of school. We tell the kids they're not allowed to bring their phones. Not uncommon for them to ask their parents to keep their streaks up because they don't want to lose them. This is a schedule of reinforcement. With Instagram and Facebook, if they were using this, but for us as adults, when we send a like, when we send a reply, it doesn't go to the receiver immediately. Why? Because your phone has figured out your rhythms, and they know a variable schedule of reinforcement is the most addictive. Think slot machines. The variable schedule keeps you pulling at the app, and you'll keep going back to it until you get the hit. But behind the scenes, the algorithms with those apps are working it so you don't get that reinforcement at the exact time that you want it, but rather it varies so that you check it more and more and more. So these kinds of schedules are at work. Our need for community, our need for connection, our need for belonging. Social media does all of that, but it can do it in some pretty sneaky ways.
So what comes to mind, and I used to say to parents, what you just shared there was such a nice synopsis of the research and what we know about human development. So I would say to them, when the kids are using whatever aspect of technology, what are they not doing that you probably would have been doing when you were their age? Whether it be going to your friend's house, going to the mall, having a job, going out and trying new things and
Exactly.
failing, and all those normal human developmental aspects that teach us about life. So that is kind of an angle I play. And I want to say to our listeners, we'll have in the show notes, I've got a wellness site. It's up on our website, and there's a section on digital wellness where I have several leaders in the field. You can read their books. One of them, The Anxious Generation, of Jonathan Haidt. His book just came out this spring. And then some people in Substack. There are also a lot of other links to help with parenting, helping with strategies as you put together your family technology use. And one of the big things to remember, the key word there is family. It's just not the kids. It's mom and dad. If mom and dad are bringing devices to the table, for example, so much of learning is modeling. So it's the whole family, right?
Absolutely. In fact, on this point, I want to highlight a couple pieces for listeners that may be new to the international scene, or if you have a child transitioning from, say, middle school to high school. These are really nice cut points for recalibrating some of the practices you have as a family around technology use. The families that I see that handle technology best, they have boundaries with it. Here's what I mean by that. If it plugs in or runs on batteries, there's a cutoff time for it at night, regardless of the kid's emotional state. The technology that they use is in an open space, not in their bedrooms. They have certain restrictions in terms of apps that they can or cannot have on their phones. I learned this through working with wonderful parents over the years who were frustrated and grieved by the process of what they saw happening with their kids around tech. So, for example, when our kids were growing up, all the way through their elementary and middle school years, in fact, they didn't get any kind of phone until they were in middle school, and that was an old school flip phone. Not a smartphone, just a SIM card phone. It wasn't because we didn't trust them. I'd met a number of parents over the years who did a wonderful job parenting. It was because the technology was bigger than what their hearts could handle. And so as parents, we had to put the boundary in place lovingly, mourn with them through the loss of what they perceived everyone else around them was getting. But there were bigger pieces at work for us as parents, and that were their hearts. And so when Silas and Corey entered the high school, they both got a smartphone, but they couldn't download any social media apps. And again, it wasn't because we didn't think they were good kids. It was because we knew what was going to be at work vying for their hearts. And we just didn't want that competition in terms of body image, worth, esteem, values. And by the time they got into their senior year, second semester with our son Silas, for example, we recognized, look, he's going off to college. He's done the things we've asked him to do over the years around tech. Generally speaking, it hadn't been an issue. We need to loosen the tethers and give him an opportunity to make some of his own choices. And he's off to college now, and our hope, prayer, our intentionality was that he's going to be able to use this tech responsibly. And we're doing that with his younger sister in grade 10 as well. So a couple pieces I would offer to parents. One, have a set time when technology is finished for the night. Two, when they're on that tech, as far as it's possible with you, try to keep it out of their rooms if you want to have any sort of semblance with them in terms of conversations. 3, no tech at the dinner table. David, you mentioned this earlier. This was a rule that we incorporated, and we still do as a family. The table's the time where we get together. For some families, it's breakfast. Some it's supper. We just wanted to create a sacred space where it was an opportunity for us to do a little bit of life around the table. And those times are going to be even more challenging for moms and dads because your phones are going to be buzzing. Your phones are going to be ringing. But the message you're communicating to your kids is that you, this person in front of me, is more important than what's happening on this device in this moment. If you set those rules and set those boundaries and consistently hold to them, your kids are going to be better off as a result of it.
Those are some great guidelines. One thing that has been pretty clear, and you've also alluded to this, is kids in general are so much more stressed out now than they were when I started teaching, for sure. So maybe you can segue into talking about helping parents understanding some of the underlying causes of this anxiety, understanding some of the adolescent behaviors like the girl storming out from the meeting with the general father. And it's, of course, about competence and fitting in. So maybe you can speak to some of the stress issues.
Yeah, I do think it folds into technology a bit as well. I don't want to categorically say it's because of tech, but it's certainly contributing variable. Our need for community and our need for acceptance is so strong that we will defer a lot of other needs in order to have that. For example, sleep. Kids who have unfettered access to technology by default will defer sleep in order to be connected. I tend to use this example of describing the phone as an information broker. So when a teenager gets access to a new novel piece of information in their group, for that brief moment of time, their social status is elevated within that social circle. And depending on how they choose to share that information out, will either elevate their status within the social group, or it could marginalize their status within the social group if they're not connected, if they're not a part of the know or what's going on in that particular group. And so depending on that kid and where they're getting their sense of community and affiliation from, social media devices can have a big impact on their heads and hearts. And that's why I recommend not having access to that device in the bedroom so that you can afford a kid the opportunity to be able to sleep. If kids don't sleep and get good rest, they don't function well. Very often, I'll have kids who come in who are stressed out and anxious, and they'll come in with their parents and they want the answer solved now. Well, the kid hasn't slept in the last 15 hours, and we're not getting anywhere until they get a good 12 hours of sleep. And so oftentimes it's, let's go home, get some sleep, and let's meet back tomorrow. And then we're in a clearer space to try to solve the issue that's happening with that kid. So part of it is trying to figure out the boundaries around the tech. The other thing I'll say is because of the immediacy of technology, kids have this constant state of gathering information. And much of the time, that information is inaccurate. But the problem with adolescents is they will run with, and adults for that matter, they will run with the perception of reality even when that perception is false. And they don't take the time to validate the perception in terms of someone saying something about them, someone not sending them something when they were supposed to receive it, someone posting them something. So that can really have a big impact on their ability to regulate their emotions. And so the challenge is trying to figure out how to put those pieces together. I will also say that legitimately kids who are struggling with anxiety are struggling with physiological pieces as well as psychological pieces. And so the challenge is trying to, couple those two pieces together and make sure they have the support for that.
So how would you say that parenting styles fit into all of this?
Yeah, good question. When we work with families, quite often they'll come in and want to talk with me about quote unquote fixing their child. But ultimately, this starts with the marriage and the relationship, trying to help parents get on the same proverbial page. And when we think about the parenting styles, it's a continuum, right? And so there's 3 kinds of parenting styles I want to talk about real quickly and to see if for the listeners out there, any of this resonates with them in terms of their parenting style. Let me say from the onset, I'm not talking about the quality of love that parents have for their kids when I talk about these parenting styles. So I don't want the listeners to think that somehow one parent loves their child more versus less. That's not the equation. It's about how we relate to our kids, though. That is what parenting styles is about. So on one end of this continuum, you have these permissive indulgent parents. And these permissive indulgent parents are the kind of parents who say things like, hey, can you guys keep it down in there? I'm trying to finish up your math. Or how did we do on the biology test? Or I don't understand how you didn't do so well in math. Let me reach out to the teacher and finish up the homework for you. I remember when my daughter was in third grade, for example, she was getting ready to go into gymnastics. And so she's waiting out there with the other kids, and there's a mom frantically working on a document of another kid's. And I look over at it, and it's math, basic math, multiplication. The kid is standing there watching her mom finish all of this work for her so that she can go out onto the gymnastics floor and not feel like she's got this pressure to get work done. Well, this parent and this kind of parenting style is an indulgent kind of parent. They give, they provide for their kids, but the message that they're actually communicating is you're not competent. You don't have the skill set.
Right.
I need to compensate for you. The kids don't have the skills. They develop this learned sense of helplessness along the way. And again, we're not talking about whether or not this parent loves their child. It's a question of how they are breeding confidence and competence in their child. So this permissive, indulgent parent is the kind of parent that basically provides all the things that a kid needs and doesn't let the kid go through the traverses of life to figure things out. Another kind of permissive parent is a permissive, indifferent parent. They're unfortunately the kind of parents who aren't there for their kids a whole lot, but provide all of the things they need. Food, shelter, clothing, a maid, but they're working an extended period of time. And in international communities, this is not uncommon to have a situation where the helper is actually raising the kid because the parents are quite frequently gone, traveling overseas, working long hours, extended trips. And so the child has seemingly all of the things that they need except for mom and dad. So these permissive, indifferent, permissive, indulgent parents are on one side of this continuum, and the authoritarian parents are on the other side of the continuum, where there isn't a lot of verbal give and take. It's my way or the highway. If I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. You will take these classes in high school. You will major in this program of study. You will apply to these colleges or universities if you want me to pay for it. And these kinds of parents, again, love their children, but they're not giving them a say in decisions that they're making throughout their life. They know what's best for their kids, and as a result, they pick everything for their kids. And the form of helplessness I see with these kids is apathy. Why do it? My parents are just going to do it for me anyways. Why engage? They're just going to tell me what I have to do. I can't decide what major I want to have. They're going to decide for me. That my dad's already told me I'm not going to pay for college if you don't have this major or apply to this school. In the middle of that continuum are the authoritative parents. These are the parents who provide the give and take. They'll listen to the reasoning. They'll provide the boundaries. And when there are tensions or conflict, what will happen is the parents' rules will need to be followed in the majority of the cases on these principal issues. So on this continuum, you've got these authoritative parents, you've got these authoritarian parents, you've got these permissive parents, and now mom and dad come into the room. And I explain this to them and I say, all right, describe for me your wife's parenting style. Describe for me your husband's parenting style. And very often there's conflict. He's never around. She doesn't follow through. They're not committed to what they're supposed to do. And the point isn't trying to get them into an argument, which invariably happens. You see all kinds of nonverbal going on as well. The point is trying to help mom and dad figure out what are your principal issues together. If I could give you 4 darts and a dartboard, and you had to throw those darts at the board to aim at something with intentionality, could you do that as a parent? Could you figure out as a team, what is it that you want for your rising 9th grader, your 5th grader, your 11th grader in terms of agency, independence, responsibility? Are you aiming at the same target? And are you being consistent in what you're doing? And I really want to emphasize this for the listeners. When I say consistent, I don't mean perfect. Your kids are going to have an off day. You're going to have an off day. But at minimum, I don't want you to parent emotionally. I want you to parent principally so that when the storms come, and they will, when the challenges happen, and they will, you can reflect on each other and say, okay, we need to be the rock for our kids through this storm. And further, on principal issues, whether it be issues around dating, sex, faith, honesty, character, you can stand united with one another when your teen uses emotion to try to get out of the consequences for the choices they're making. So that whole part of the parenting continuum is so incredibly important. And this is irrespective of whether or not you're living in the United States or traveling abroad. And I want to emphasize this. On some principal issues as parents, your kids shouldn't get an out or an exemption because you're living in another country. Just because everyone does X in a particular country doesn't give license for your child to engage in that as well, if these are principal issues. But everything can't be a principal issue as well. I like the way Ben Franklin says this. He says, in matters of style, go with the current. In matters of principle, stand like a rock. And so what are some of these principal issues for you as a parent that you're willing to stand like a rock? And then what are some of these issues of style that are just seemingly like, I'll let it go? I was reminded of a story by a psychologist by the name of Kevin Lehman. He has like 6 kids, right? And one of his boys comes down one night, he's a teenager, and he says, I'm getting my ear pierced. And, they're sitting at the table and he's kind of giving this bravado. Dad doesn't say anything. He just kind of eats his food. Well, the next night, get downstairs to eat, and Dad's running a little bit late. So the kids are all down at the table waiting. Dad comes down with his ear pierced and a giant feather hanging from his ear. He doesn't say anything at all. He just sits at the table, and his kid's looking at him. And that teenage boy the other night who says he's going to get his ear pierced looks at him, what are you doing? He said, well, I got my ear pierced. Isn't this what all the cool kids do? He said, that looks stupid, man. Where'd you do that? Well, if you're going to do it, I'm going to do it. He never did get his ear pierced.
Go figure.
And the message was sent in an easy sort of way, right? And so there's issues of style as parents, and we can figure out our approach. Not everything has to be a principal issue. In fact, I would say if everything is a principal issue, something's probably wrong with your parenting style. So that's kind of the way I think about it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And the whole idea of communication with your spouse around what are your principal issues and so on.
That's huge.
Which leads nicely into our next topic, which is values. Putting value on your values. Maybe you could talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I used to give this activity for parents to do when I gave a parenting talk. And if you want to do this as you're listening to this, go ahead and do it. You take out your phone and you type in 2016 word of the year. 2016 word of the year. If you look up that word, you're going to see the word post-truth. Post-truth. And you might be thinking to yourself, 2016 word of the year, post-truth. What in the world does that mean? Well, post-truth is the world which our kids are growing up in. Post-truth essentially means there isn't a truth. Your truth, my truth, based on emotional states. There aren't really any rules that govern logic or reasoning. In fact, there's a deconstruction of truth, and it's often predicated on emotion or intensity of emotion. Meaning is not really defined by empirical adequacy or logical consistency. It's more defined by my lived experience versus your lived experience. And there isn't really a scale to weigh that other than personal preferences. And so in this postmodern world that we live in, part of the challenge is helping kids understand what your value system is. And in an international community, parents and kids will be lovingly and sometimes unabashedly confronted with a whole host of different worldviews that are competing for their hearts and heads, whether it be issues around how they look at religion, sex, smoking, substance use, and the list goes on and on. So most schools embody a set of core values or principles. Like, for example, at our school, we talk about the importance of compassion, fairness, honesty, respect, responsibility. We talk about extraordinary care, and we do this under the umbrella of the big C's, character, communication, collaboration, creativity, innovation, critical thinking, cultural competence, core knowledge, right? So those are kind of the ethos, all wrapped in this idea of joy. But the reality is you as parents have a whole set of values as well. I can assure you, if you choose to raise your kids in any kind of school setting, even a private school, you're going to find things that are very much in line with what you value. And you will find hopefully some things that run against the grain of what you believe as a family. And I say hopefully some, because if everything, again, is a principal issue, you're in the wrong school. You got to find a different school to attend because it's just so confrontational for you and your kids. The good news is there are a host of different international schools located in most countries, major cities throughout the world, that can cater to your value systems to a degree. But do know that the primary influence that your kids need in their lives is you. I'm often told that, as kids get older, they don't need their parents as much, or they're not as important in their lives as their peers. I tend to disagree with that. The way kids need us is different. So instead of directing and providing in those earlier years, as they move into adolescence, we're listening and guiding. But the belief is that you've taken the time to instill in them over the years a set of principles and values and beliefs. What you want for your kids is for them to give pause when they're out with their friends and ask themselves, what would my mom or dad do if I chose to do this? Wait, I know this is going to be upsetting for my parents if I chose to not do this. Or I know if I chose to do this, my parents would be well pleased with that. Let me give you an example. I had a student I was working with a few years back who had a curfew. It was 11 o'clock at night. And he and his parents and I worked on this together, kind of come up with some of these boundaries. Well, not more than 2 weeks into this kid shows up at 1 o'clock in the morning, and his parents are ticked. They've been trying to text him the whole night, trying to get a hold of him. We went over the rules. We talked about the importance of it, even talked about the consequences. And yet this kid chose, seemingly, to not come home at 1 o'clock. So he walks into the house and he says to his mom and dad, and by the way, mom and dad are telling the story to me, right, proudly. He walks into the house and says, wait, mom and dad, don't get mad, don't get mad. It was Sarah. I had to take care of Sarah. Well, he went on to tell the story about all the friends that went down to Boat Key and got drunk, including Sarah. Sarah drank so much that she passed out, and all the other kids left her. Well, he was concerned that something could happen to her. So he put her in a taxi, took her home, went with the parents when they took her to the hospital, and that was a couple-hour shift. He didn't want to text his parents because he didn't quite know what he was going to say to them about the whole situation. Well, he's over 2 hours late. His parents hear this story, and they realize you did a really good thing.
Right.
We went through this whole process of putting this rule together, but you made a choice that we would have hoped you would have made to look after someone else. Now, we're going to talk about the alcohol piece and being responsible, but this was a good decision to make, to look after another person. These kinds of exceptions will happen when you make rules. And parents, the idea is you want your kids long-term to be able to have that kind of character that you're modeling to them. And this was one of those times where even though there was a rule around being home at X hour, we allow gratitude and grace and thankfulness that, in this case, their child made the right choice in terms of looking after this kid. So I say to parents often, what are your values? Don't think for a second that your kids aren't going to pick them up from somewhere. And certainly do not leave this to schools. You have wonderful educators that are going to work with your kids, hopefully great counselors who want to impart pearls of wisdom to them. But at the end of the day, they need to hear your voice. Do not abdicate this most important responsibility. And this is something that's going to carry on long past high school. They'll be looking to you for guidance and wisdom about, should I marry this person? Should I take this job? Can you help me set up this bank account? How does a home loan work? And by the way, I will say this to you. The last 4 years of high school will set the tone and tempo quite often for the next 30. So think about that for a second. These kids of yours are going to be making decisions about your medical issues when you're older. So just something to keep in mind there.
Giving a little bit of grace there to hope to get it in return. So well put and so true. Thank you so much for being with us today. How can our listeners follow you if they would like to learn more about what you're talking about with parenting kids overseas?
Yeah, if folks are interested in learning more about me, certainly you can look up my book, A Parent's Guide to Raising Kids Overseas. That's available on Amazon. I don't have a large social media presence. On the finance side of stuff with teachers, I do have a Facebook page that I'm a part of with international teachers. And maybe for you expat parents out there that are interested in learning a little bit more about that piece as well, that's something you can do. But I want to close by saying this. Your kids need you. They need you in the game. And sometimes as a parent, we feel inadequate. We feel like we failed our kids. Look, give yourself some grace. If you got 1 or 2 kids like we do, you're going to make mistakes. Learn how to apologize to your kids and keep moving forward. When you apologize to your kids that you messed up, you're not demonstrating weakness. You're showing them how to reconcile a relationship. Take the time to acknowledge what you need to own and move forward. Stay intentional about helping launch your kids to be healthy, confident, independent, responsible when they leave the nest in 4 years. Relate to them in different ways, but continue to relate to them. Sometimes they just need your physical presence. They don't necessarily need a long, drawn-out conversation. Their timetable is going to be a little different than yours as they go through life, but that structure, that predictability, that consistency as you transition overseas or throughout your international career is something they're going to thrive on. And by the way, so too will your relationship with your partner, with your spouse, with your friends that you're going to make. International education is a wonderful, enriching place to work and serve families. And so you've chosen a really life-changing experience, not only for your kids, but for yourselves. But stay in the game. Don't defer this responsibility to someone else.
Jeff, thanks for bringing it back to our guiding question dealing with international parenting. And I think our listeners are going, wow, this has really been about parenting in general. So whether you are in your hometown listening to this as a teacher thinking about going overseas, or you're already overseas, Jeff has shared so much about parenting in general. The whole idea of having principles, values, structures, really good communication, the whole topic of digital wellness. Boy, I'm just scratching the surface of what you've covered here, Jeff. So folks, this might be an episode that you share with your non-teacher friends as just an option to think about their parenting approach. When I was a counselor, I would say, it's something you really got to work at. Let's talk about your parenting style as Jeff has. Here are some book possibilities to put together your plan with your partner on how you're going to parent. So just so much, Jeff, that you've shared here. And I think this is an episode so many listeners will connect to.
Thank you so much. Such wisdom. And really, it's been wonderful to chat with you and so appreciate what you bring to the table. Thanks again.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you for joining us today on Educators Going Global.
You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, and all the other usual suspects.
Please subscribe, like us, and leave a review on Apple and Spotify, and let your teaching friends know about us so we can grow our community.
Please reach out at educatorsgoingglobal@gmail.com and join our Facebook group, Educators Going Global, if you have ideas, comments, or wish to share a Going Global story of your own.
You can also find us on Instagram at Educators Going Global.
Please visit our website as well, www.educatorsgoingglobal.com. All our podcast episodes are on there by topic, along with blog posts, Going Global stories, and our ever-growing resource library. For now, this is Audrey
And David.
inviting you to travel,
Teach.
and connect with us.